unlock the secrets of a mysterious and twisted tale of romance with the Invisible Man, a grotesque romance by H.G. Wells. Follow the story of Griffin, a scientist who discovers the secret to invisibility and soon realizes the terrifying consequences of his newfound power. Watch as he struggles to maintain his morality while being haunted by his own monstrous actions. Experience the thrilling and grotesque journey of this fascinating classic novel as it takes you deep into the darkness of human nature. Chapter 1. The Strange Man's Arrival. In this chapter, a mysterious stranger arrives in the wintry town of Iping. He is heavily bundled up, wearing large blue spectacles and a bandage that covers most of his face. The stranger checks into the Coach and Horses Inn where Mrs. Hall, the landlady, attends to him and prepares a meal. During their interaction, Mrs. Hall notices the stranger's odd and somewhat unsettling behavior. He keeps his hat and coat on, hides his face with a white cloth, and speaks through it. Despite Mrs. Hall's attempts to engage in conversation, the stranger remains distant and enigmatic. Mrs. Hall later discovers that the stranger's face is severely injured or disfigured as he never removes the cloth that covers it. Despite this, she continues to provide for him and shares stories of accidents and injuries, but the stranger remains unresponsive. He stays in the inn for several hours, mostly in silence, occasionally pacing the room and talking to himself. This chapter leaves the reader intrigued by the stranger's peculiar appearance and behavior, setting the stage for further mysteries and revelations in the story. Chapter 2. Mr. Teddy Hinfrey's First Impressions. In this chapter, Mr. Teddy Hinfrey, a clock jobber, arrives at the Coach and Horses Inn during a snowstorm. Mrs. Hall, the innkeeper, asks him to fix the clock in the parlor as it has stopped working correctly. When he enters the room, he finds the mysterious stranger still wearing bandages and goggles, sitting by the fire. The stranger is initially dozing, but wakes up when Mr. Hinfrey enters. The stranger and Mr. Hinfrey exchange a few words, with the stranger expressing a desire for solitude and uninterrupted work due to his weak and sensitive eyes. Mrs. Hall then asks about the stranger's luggage, which he explains contains equipment and apparatus for his experiments. He mentions needing the room for his private use and requests not to be disturbed until the clock is fixed. Mr. Hinfrey attempts to repair the clock, but the stranger's presence makes him feel uneasy, leading to a brief confrontation before Mr. Hinfrey leaves the room. He shares his encounter with Hall, the conveyance driver, who also finds the stranger's appearance peculiar. Later that night, Mrs. Hall wakes up from a disturbing dream about the stranger, plagued by images of bizarre and monstrous heads. Despite her fears, she tries to dismiss them and goes back to sleep. This chapter introduces the enigmatic stranger who has taken up residence at the inn, setting the stage for growing suspicions and curiosity surrounding him. Chapter 3. The 1001 Bottles. In this chapter, the mysterious stranger arrives at the Coach and Horses Inn carrying a collection of bottles and containers. He exhibits peculiar behavior and remains focused on his work. When Fear Inside's dog attacks him, the stranger swiftly defends himself, resulting in torn trousers. Later, Mr. Hall attempts to check on the stranger in his room, but is forcefully denied entry. The stranger continues to exhibit erratic behavior, obsessively working with his bottles and test tubes. He becomes increasingly agitated and frustrated, spouting incoherent rants. Mrs. Hall offers the stranger tea, only to be met with impatience and a broken bottle on the floor. The stranger insists on being left undisturbed to continue his work. Outside the inn, Fear Inside notices something strange about the stranger's appearance. While his face appears pale, His legs and hands are entirely black. Fear Inside speculates that he may be a half-breed or piebald with patches of black and white coloring. This chapter ends with readers left intrigued and curious about the stranger's true identity and the purpose of his experiments. The townspeople grow increasingly suspicious of him due to his unusual behavior and appearance. Chapter 4. Mr. Cuss interviews the stranger. In this chapter, we explore the stranger's time in the village of Iping and the response he elicits from the villagers. Although there are a few peculiar incidents, we do not delve into the specifics of his stay in great detail until the club festival. The stranger displays odd behavior, exhibiting erratic work habits and seldom venturing out during daylight hours. Opinions regarding the stranger vary among the villagers. Some suspect him of being a fugitive evading the law, while others label him an anarchist or merely a harmless madman. The villagers feel uneasy and suspicious due to his peculiar appearance, aggressive demeanor, and enigmatic experiments. The town's doctor, Mr. Cuss, becomes deeply fascinated by the stranger and decides to interview him. During their conversation, Mr. Cuss is taken aback when the stranger demonstrates a peculiar skill. The ability to move his empty sleeve in a manner that appears to pinch his nose like fingers. Overwhelmed by a sense of disturbance, Mr. Cuss hastily exits the room, firmly convinced that there is something inexplicable and unnatural about the stranger. The chapter concludes as Mr. Cuss shares the encounter with Mr. Bunting, the local vicar. Mr. Bunting finds the account intriguing but maintains a skeptical stance towards Mr. Cuss's apprehension. The enigma surrounding the stranger is deepened, leaving both the villagers and readers captivated by his unsettling and mysterious presence in Iping. Chapter 5. The Burglary at the Vicarage. In Chapter 5, the vicar and his wife describe a burglary that occurred at their home on Whit Monday. Mrs. Bunting awakens to the sound of footsteps and wakes her husband, who proceeds to investigate. While searching, they hear suspicious noises emanating from the study, discover a lit candle, and come to the realization that money has been stolen. Despite hearing strange sounds and the door slamming shut spontaneously, they find no signs of an intruder when they search the house. The perplexing and unsettling nature of these mysterious events leaves the vicar and his wife baffled. Chapter 6. The Furniture That Went Mad. In Chapter 6, on Whit Monday, the stranger mysteriously disappears from his room, leaving Mr. and Mrs. Hall intrigued. They find his clothing and bandages scattered about, along with the front door left unlatched. As they delve into the investigation, the furniture in the stranger's room unpredictably comes to life, apparently under the control of unseen forces. The bedclothes leap off the bed, the hat soars through the air, the chair charges at Mrs. Hall, creating chaos in the room. Mrs. Hall, attributing this unusual phenomenon to spirits, seeks assistance from Mr. Wodgers, the blacksmith, and Mr. Huckster. While they are deliberating on the course of action, the stranger suddenly reappears, slamming the door shut abruptly, leaving everyone astonished and unable to proceed further. Chapter 7. The Unveiling of the Stranger. In Chapter 7 of the novel, the stranger, who is later revealed to be the Invisible Man, seeks refuge at the Coach and Horses Inn after a failed burglary. While at the inn, he successfully avoids being noticed by the other patrons. However, when the innkeeper, Mrs. Hall, demands payment for his bill, he astounds everyone by demonstrating his invisibility. This revelation shocks the onlookers and causes a commotion. The villagers attempt to arrest the Invisible Man, but he fights back using his invisibility to elude their grasp. Consequently, Chaos ensues as the villagers struggle to apprehend the elusive invisible man. Amidst the confusion, Constable Jaffers is knocked unconscious, providing an opportunity for the invisible man to escape.